And finally, for our third and final story for this week, it was inevitable. They came for Columbus, the mob did. The mob came for Jefferson, for Lincoln, for Washington. They came for Francis Scott Key, and now they have come for the national anthem itself. A Yahoo story this past week asked if the national anthem, if it's not time to retire the national anthem because it's problematic. And surprise, surprise, the answer is, of course we should retire the national anthem because it is so horribly, horribly racist. And why is it racist? Well, because Francis Scott Key wrote it and because of that damn third stanza. Now, this quote that I'm going to read to you from that piece, it's very long, but I need to read it in its entirety so that you get a feeling, a sense, and a flavor of what's behind this idea. This quote comes from Kevin Powell, a described activist and journalist. And this is him being quoted from that Yahoo story about why the national anthem is quote-unquote problematic. Here it is. Quote, "The Star Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key, who was literally born into a wealthy, slave-holding family in Maryland. He was a very well-to-do lawyer in Washington, D.C., and eventually became very close to President Andrew Jackson, who was the Donald Trump of his time, which means there was a lot of hate and violence and division. At that time, there were attacks on Native Americans and black folks, both free black folks and folks who were slaves, and Francis Scott Key was very much a part of that. He was also the brother-in-law of someone who became a Supreme Court Justice, Roger Taney, who also had a very hardcore policy around slavery. And so, all of that is problematic, and the fact that Key, when he was a lawyer, also prosecuted abolitionists, both white and black folks who wanted slavery to end, says that this is someone who really did not believe in freedom for all people, and yet, we celebrate him with this national anthem every time we sing it, unquote. First and foremost, second of all, how many people today actually know that Francis Scott Key wrote the Star Spangled Banner? How many people, when you asked them what the national anthem is of the United States, how many people would even today be able to tell you that it is the Star Spangled Banner? Remember, it didn't become the national anthem until 1933. Before that, the unofficial anthem was Hail Columbia, which is also now problematic because Columbia is, comes from Columbus. Racist. So that's kind of the first point. How many people actually know that Francis Scott Key wrote the Star Spangled Banner, and how many people even know that the Star Spangled Banner is the national anthem? Again, if you ask them the name for the anthem. That's the first thing. Second of all, Andrew Jackson, he was not the Trump of his time. Okay, just because Trump likes Andrew Jackson and has tried to present himself as a 21st century of Andrew Jackson, I would say that he's not. It tells far more about you and your ignorance of history than about Andrew Jackson, Trump, Jacksonian democracy, early 19th century American history, or anything else. Because Andrew Jackson was not the Donald Trump of his time. There was actually a lot of national unity at that time because the common people loved Andrew Jackson. They swept him into office in 1828. It was the beginning of Jacksonian democracy. It was seen as the beginning of where the common man and the little people were going to actually have a bigger say and a bigger voice in the federal government. He fought against the national banks. He fought against secession, which should earn him some points from the left today. One of the arguments that you hear about why all of these horrible Confederate statues and memorials need to be taken down is because they were all traitors. They committed treason against the United States, which doesn't make any sense anyway because Nicole Hannah-Jones in her 1619 Project says that the United States was always and ever shall be a horribly racist country, so succeeding from it and committing treason against it, I don't see what the problem is against that. But regardless, Jackson was firmly against secession. In fact, when South Carolina threatened to secede because of the federal tariff that Jackson had proposed supported and signed into law, he actually sent the U.S. Navy down there. He had troops at the ready. He said, you damn well are not going to succeed. That is not an option for any one of us, I'm sorry to say. And actually, the crisis passed. I mean, it would come back about give or take a few years, but 30 years down the road, it came back. But that was Andrew Jackson. Also, yes, while he did do horrible things to some Indian tribes, the Cherokee, with the Trail of Tears and everything, other tribes he was very friendly towards, defended them, in fact, from settlers. So, a complex man. Oh, and he was the founder of the Democrat Party along with Martin Van Buren. That's the second thing. The third thing is that Francis Scott Key was a slave owner, but he was an early opponent of slave trafficking. He freed several of his slaves during his own life, which you would think would actually win him a few extra points over even Washington on the left. Because as we all know, I mean, Washington freed all of the slaves he owned, but only upon his death. So if you're on the left, they'll say, oh, that doesn't really count. Key actually freed several of his slaves when he was still alive, which should count for something. And he also had a deserved reputation for giving free legal advice to poor white and black men. Okay? He was also the only white man to actually ride in a funeral procession for a leader of the black community of Baltimore when he passed away. In fact, it was so prominent, it was so well known that even an abolitionist newspaper had to recognize that and to praise him for that and to say, hey, yeah, here you did good. Usually we're on the opposite side because we're an abolitionist paper, you are a slave owner, but here you did good, Mr. Key. You done good. And the fourth thing is that this is now very Soviet-esque territory that we are at. I mean, if you look at several of the reasons, Kevin Powell here doesn't really get into reasons of how Key was a problematic person himself, except that he had slaves. But one of the reasons why he owned slaves was because he was born into a slaveholding family. That in and of itself is a reason why he needs to be scrubbed from history. He was friends with the quote-unquote Donald Trump of his day. He was the brother-in-law of Robert Taney, who was the Chief Justice when the Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision. Okay? These are not things that Francis Scott Key could control. He was friends with Andrew Jackson. Okay, the brother-in-law of Robert Taney. He was born into this particular family. Except for his friendship with Jackson, he can't control any of that. He can't control who his sister marries. He can't control what family he's born into. If that becomes the criteria now of why certain people have to be canceled in our culture, then none of us is safe. You could be the most woke person in the universe, but if you were born into a family who can trace its lineage back to, I don't know, Colonel Rutherford Bloomington IV of the 45th Mississippi Division, which fought at Chickamauga in some, obscure part of that battle, you were born into the wrong family. Instant excommunication. Instant excommunication. They've done it here with Key. They've done it here with all of us. Our very families now are weapons to be used against us. Our friendships now are weapons to be used against us. Because don't think for a minute that this is going to stop with historical figures that they don't like, and they don't like any of them. But don't think for a second that this is just going to stop with historical figures. The precedent is being set that if you are part of certain families, if you're friends with certain people, oh my God, if certain people marry into your family, you are the enemy. And you will be punished, and you will be persecuted, and you will be excommunicated. Damnatio memoriam, as they said in ancient Rome. So that's the first part. That's the part about Key himself being problematic. Now the second part, the third stanza, which everyone now harps about, which no one even really remembered until the progressives brought it up, because we don't even sing anything. The national anthem, maybe officially is the entire Star Spangled Banner, but we only sing the first stanza. That's what most of us only are acquainted with. But anyway, the third stanza, this is what it says. And where is that band who so valiantly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country, should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Now, a lot of people, when they hear that, the hireling and slave, no refuge could save the hireling and slave, what a lot of people think that Key was referring to is, of course, a lot of the black slaves. A lot of black slaves in the South during the War of 1812 did escape from their from the farms and from the people who held them, from their masters. And they escaped to the British Navy, to the British Army, because the British put out a proclamation saying, hey, if you escape, if you come and fight for us in good faith, we'll grant you your freedom. And so a lot of slaves, of course, jumped at the opportunity, right? So that's what some people say. Now, of course, an alternate interpretation, and one that's just as valid, is that Key is actually taking some artistic license here. And when he says the hireling, that would be foreign mercenaries that the British government at the time was very fond of hiring. Think the Hessians during the American Revolution. The slave here is talking about the British soldiers who are fighting in the army of and for the tyrant George III. Because, surprise, surprise, George III didn't disappear in a cloud of smoke after the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, which recognized the United States as an independent country. Or more accurately, it recognized the 13 different colonies as independent states, which formed an association called the United States of America. George III is still the King of England, of Great Britain, at the time of the War of 1812. And in Americans' mind, in the minds of Americans, he is still the great tyrant. He is the one who tried to squeeze away, to wrest away the hard-won freedoms and liberties of the American people, tried to deny them their liberties. And so anyone who fights for him, anyone who fights for a tyrant, is a slave. Because if you are living underneath a tyrant's rule, you're a slave. You are not free. That's another interpretation of that third stanza, and one that I will say again is equally just as valid. Again, given the circumstances and the time period that we have. But there's more to that, because by simply saying that the national anthem is quote-unquote problematic because of this third stanza, because the third stanza is obviously racist, it also erases several historical facts, because, things that we used to call facts, what we used to call facts. A lot of slaves escaped their masters and went into the British Navy and the British Army. But a lot of slaves also escaped and joined the American Army and the American Navy, especially the American Navy. 15% of all American sailors in the War of 1812 were black. One of them was a man by the name of Charles Ball. He escaped, and he actually had a choice. He was, I believe that he was from Maryland, and he was swimming in the Chesapeake. And he had two choices. He could join the British, or he could join the Americans. Guess what? He joined the Americans. He became a cannoneer, became a gunner for the cannons. And after the war, Charles Ball was actually one of the people who went to a bunch of former slaves who had joined the British side. He tried to convince them to come home. Okay? History is messy. The vast majority of the people and the events in history are very, very messy. Don't let anyone anyone ever tell you that all of history, from the beginning of its recording to the present, is simple black and white. Because it's not. There are events that are black and white. There are people who are more or less black and white. They form a very small minority in the historical record. Okay? Here's a few more facts. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, best known for the Battle of Lake Erie, he complained about having blacks on his ship, but Commodore Isaac Chauncey replied to Captain Perry, "I have nearly 50 blacks on this boat, and many of them are among the best of my men." And in fact, after the Battle of Lake Erie, where Captain Oliver Hazard Perry actually had a chance to see these black American sailors in action, he wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy where he praised their courage. He said, "Hey, these guys are great fighters. They're great. They're terrific." So those are actually, those are, what we call facts. Things that actually happened, okay? It's not black and white. The national anthem is not black and white. That third stanza is not black and white. And just to top everything off, what do they want to replace it with? Well, that Kevin Powell again, he suggested John Lennon's Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. I can't get the tune right, and I don't want to sing any more of it because it's a horrible song. Powell says that should be our national anthem because it's the most pro-people song that there is. And I just have to point out the irony of making a song that doesn't want any national borders, that doesn't see anything good about different people, different cultures, different languages, different countries. The irony of making that song a national anthem. The anti-nation song being made the anthem for a nation. That is bitingly ironic. But maybe at this point, that's what we deserve. But anyway, I'm wrapping it up here, gang. Have a great weekend. I will see you all next time. Ciao.